And what the issues that we're going to look at are, and that we focused on for this initiative, are what are the copyright issues that an initiative like this that is seeking to pull together dark archives. What kind of copyright issues are we going to be looking at, and how should we deal with them? And so I was particularly lucky when, and I was thrilled to be asked by Dorothy to participate in this initiative, because the work that you all are doing here and this and the aim is obviously very important, as we've discussed already today. So that's particularly exciting. My concern as I was going into this was that I really don't know anything about copyright. I actually teach in other areas of the law. I know a little bit, but not my area of expertise. Teach negotiation, so I'll talk for a few minutes about that. But I was very fortunate to have a student who is something of an expert on copyright law, or I should say more broadly, intellectual property. Carolyn Pinkston is a 2L, is that right, or 3L this year? Third-year student this year, but she actually had a life and a career before coming to law school as an engineer. And came to law school as a member of the patent bar, and has worked very closely with some of our intellectual property professors on some of their more intricate work. So she actually has a background that was pretty rich in this stuff, and she found the issues interesting to think about as well. So I asked her to do a little bit of research for us and to identify as a general matter. We're not going to get into the level of detail that we would in a law school class or anything like that, but just an orientation toward the copyright issues that a project like this really should consider as it moves forward. So she'll talk for a minute about this. She has prepared a paper for this conference that Jeff Beeson is going to load up onto the website. So feel free to download that after it's posted. And with no further ado, I'll invite you to welcome with me Carolyn Pinkston.
Let's go ahead and start first. What is a copyright? I'm sure all of you have seen a symbol like this at one time or another, and especially on web pages. And this basically means that it is copyright protected. The part that's kind of interesting about this is it actually gives you a limited legal monopoly to derive benefit and prevent others from doing this. And not only that, but it actually gives you the right, if you are the owner of this copyright, the ability to be able to reproduce, and in this case it would be the newspapers, to be able to publish those newspapers. Now, the part that's also interesting, though, for newspapers is the fact that you do not actually need to register this. And they consider it as soon as it's put into a medium expression, it is protected. So newspapers are considered protected under literary works. Now, the facts within the newspaper are not protected. However, the expression of those articles and authors' individual expression of those facts are protected. The exclusive rights and duration of a copyright, kind of like what I mentioned before, a lot of the exclusive rights are actually, think of them as and I'm sure you've heard of property rights, as a stick of bundles. Yes? And that's why I put a bundle of sticks. Pardon me, I said that backwards. Bundle of sticks up there. And this basically gives you the exclusive rights to be able to reproduce those copies, to be able to prepare derivative copies, distribute the copies, and then to perform and display them publicly. In this case, it would be actually publishing the newspaper. The duration of a copyright. Now, this is also generally for any type of other work, which would be sculptural works, pictures, any type of sound recordings. They generally last about 70 years of the author's life after the death. However, in the case of works made for hire, they last 95 years from that first publication or 120 years from the creation. Now, something is created when it is exactly what I mentioned before, when it's first put into an expression. So this would be when it's on a website, when it's on an electronic document on a computer, when it's a hard copy on a table. It is not when it's just within somebody's head. That is not copyrightable. That is simply an idea. Ownership of a copyright, generally this is the author of that work, unless, once again, the problem that would come into this would be the newspapers, and this would be works for hire. And works for hire are a little bit of a different sort, which would be more applicable in this case. And works for hire is exactly what you can see. It's actually owned by the employer if done within the scope of employment. Or what they have done is actually put it in a written instrument for a work for hire. And what you're going to see on the next slide is a actual flow chart that I actually created, because you can see it's a little bit more complicated than just giving you, oh, it is the author of that work, because that's not always the case. Now, something I do want to point out right here is on the very far right, where you see ownership vests in the author or authors of the article. That's not, there's a little bit missing right there, and that I would like to add on for you guys. And there was a 2001 Supreme Court decision in Ticini versus the New York Times. Has anybody heard about this case with freelance? Okay, yeah. I'm sure okay. Well, and I'm sure you know how this has changed that, where in actual practice, they actually have, this is for those of you who have not heard about it, this would be for the New York Times. The Supreme Court actually found against the New York Times in terms of a freelance journalist because, and I believe somebody was asking earlier about electronic databases, the New York Times was actually licensing their editions of the newspaper to an electronic database, LexisNexis. The freelance journalist got a little upset and so went ahead and filed suit against the New York Times. The Supreme Court decided that they did not have the right to go ahead and license those works without their permission. So from that time forward, what newspapers have done, as I'm sure you're all well aware, is with freelance, they actually have them sign contracts, which is where you see the work made for hire, which would be in the written instrument. The next thing that I'm going to kind of go over now is the exceptions to, I'm sorry, I can't see those screens real well, so that's why I'm looking at my papers, and I'm sorry, because I have no way of seeing that otherwise. But exceptions to the exclusive rights. Now, this is important because a lot of the time, something may actually be considered fair use, which I'm going to discuss in a minute, or it actually may be in public domain. And when something's already in public domain, this is because the copyright's already expired. So remember when I was talking about the duration of a copyright, about it lasting about 95 years from the date, either the date of its publication or 120 years after its creation? This is where it would come into use. So this would mean works in 1905 and 1906. They're fair game. They're considered in public domain. Now, everything from 1906 on over into 2011, that's a little bit more of a gray area, and that's on a case-by-case basis. That is because there is no longer a valid copyright. And I'm sure all of us have accessed at one time or another. I think YouTube is the second most searched web engine out there. And a lot of the time what you'll see is you'll see these videos that are out there. And it'll be this video that you're like, wow, I really want to hear this song, or it may be in a forwarded email or whatever it might be. And a lot of the time you'll actually get this warning up there where file not found that may have been removed to a copyright violation. And this is because somebody has told, and I'm just naming an example as YouTube is something you might see for why it would actually be taken down, because somebody has sent a letter saying, hey, this is my copyright, I'm going to take suit if you do not take this down. Now what I want to go ahead and go over with you next is a little bit more fair use. This is going to be important for the newspaper examples because if you are using this and you can see the purposes of news reporting, comments, criticism, scholarship, teaching, that is not considered any type of copyright violation. Now, that is, once again, on a case-by-case basis. So I don't want to give you it is in all cases of this because that's not necessarily the fact. For example, a lot of the time in teaching, they will, and I'm not sure, I would have to look back over a couple of my notes, and I can let you know this later on if you are curious at any time, but you are limited in the amount of copies that you can actually make and distribute to your pupils in a class or to colleagues. And I don't know if it's 6 to 11. It's not a great amount is what I'm trying to get at. And if that is the case, that means you will have to go to the copyright holder and ask them some questions. But these are actually factors that they actually do look at with whether or not something is considered in fair use or not. Now, something that I want to go ahead and talk about next is going to be dark hive examples. Now, these are specific newspapers that have gone dark and exactly what type of copyright implications you would have with each one of these. The first one would be the totally dark newspaper, the O'Fallon News. Has anybody heard of the O'Fallon News? Okay, a couple of you guys have. Okay. Well, I kind of found this interesting because apparently the individual who bought this, it was operating under bankruptcy in 1978, started in 1951, and there is actually a graduate he went to law school and he also got his journalism degree from here as well, had basically bought the intellectual property rights in 1978 and went ahead and continued operation of the newspaper. Now, in 1992, he could no longer do this and went ahead and sold out all the rights. Now, the part that would be most applicable here is the fact that what had happened during this time is that these archives became something that I call stagnant. And this is where I believe Dorothy went ahead and gave to Richard it was a listing for these archived materials because they were just basically sitting around. I don't know if it was in somebody's garage, somebody's basement, or whatever it might have been. But these had a potential of being lost, and nobody would have been able to access these again in the future, which is particularly important. Now, right now, these are actually here. Actually, it's kind of funny. They are over at Ellis Library down in the basement because they are trying to work on digitizing this because the School of Journalism did recognize that this was important and try to find funding from an estate that they went ahead and donated to go ahead and have these archives sent to the St. Charles Historical Society, which was where they will be as soon as they are done at Ellis Library. Now, another newspaper, this one's kind of funny. It's a small world. I do have to tell you, it's the Albuquerque Tribune. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the Albuquerque Tribune was a particular newspaper that I used to deliver. This was 17, 18 years ago. And so when this first came across, I was like, oh my God, what happened to Albuquerque Tribune? I love the Albuquerque Tribune. And it no longer is around because it actually closed in 2008. Now, all the copyrights with this is owned by E.W. Scripps Company. Now, E.W. Scripps did go ahead and donate these to the Albuquerque Public Library, but they are not digitized. So this is very difficult to get your hands on a copy of this. It's not like you can, unless you know the specific article or the specific date or author, there is no way that they're going to be able to find this for you. And this is important for somebody who's trying to research back over Albuquerque's history, which may not sound significant to everybody else because it's Albuquerque. You know, it wasn't Bugs Bunny that would always try to avoid Albuquerque. Yeah? Okay. The next example that I actually want to go on to is the primarily online newspaper, AnnArbor.com. Now, the AnnArbor.com was actually a newspaper that they were kind of looking to cut back on a lot of what was kind of going on because, and I'm sure that this is a problem that you have all experienced, is they could no longer operate off of doing print, and so they went to a primarily online newspaper. Now, they do own their own rights, the copyrights, but the parts that I want to point out to you, now this is the AnnArbor.com. You do have ways that you can go ahead and search on their line for digitized copies of this, and there are keyword searches that they have. I'm sorry, I had to cut it down for purpose of being able to fit it up here so you could actually tell what it was that's up on the screen, but that is a screenshot of their website as of yesterday. Now, the part that I do want to point out to you is there are no safeguards in place. So basically what would happen is all of this is digitized. They don't have, there's no way to be able to save these types of archives. So if this newspaper went out of business, these are all put on servers out there. And by putting on servers, if this newspaper goes out of business or becomes defunct, what would eventually happen is if they don't have the money to pay that server or whoever might be maintaining that server, that material has potential of just being completely lost. And that seems pretty significant to individuals who want to be able to get these newspaper articles again in the future because that will no longer be there and it will no longer exist. Because and I don't know if anybody else used to have this idea, but I used to have this opinion that if it's on the internet, it's permanently on the internet. That's not the case. So, and that's why this is particularly important. Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you really quickly. I don't have a specific bankruptcy newspaper that it has actually gone through this. So I just want to go ahead and demonstrate to you exactly why this is significant. Is because, as I talked about before, whether or not something is considered a work made for hire. And the reason why this is important is specifically on the right side of the screen where you see was the newspaper liquidated. So this means that a private individual can go out and buy any type of intellectual property rights to that newspaper. Once that private individual gets it, what's going to happen to it? They could potentially store it away from everybody and not ever give it a right, or create a complete monopoly and never give it up to anybody else again. So a lot of this historical content is going to be lost. And then not only that, but if you kind of like what I talked about before with the Albuquerque Tribune, where it's with the library, this is not a digital, you wouldn't be able to get it digitally. So it's very difficult if you're looking for a specific historical piece, perhaps over, gosh, I don't know, the balloon fiesta, in October of, 1972, you may not always be able to get that. And going forward with this, kind of keeping this in mind and certain types of problems that you see going on here, I just want to go ahead and leave you guys with a couple of questions that you're going to want to consider in the future. And I hate to leave you with the answer that it all depends, and whoever owns the copyright, it all depends, and whether or not you can use this material, it all depends. I hope I gave you a little bit more of an understanding with why I'm giving you that answer and why it's not so clear-cut as it would seem. Now, if you are looking at negotiations with any type of these copyright holders, things that you should consider is that it is costly and it is time-consuming to identify, as we can see from those prior slides. The types and locations of the dark archives could be potential. For example, if it's an online website for newspapers, that might be a little bit less expensive than if it's a print newspaper that you're trying to get those archives. You got to scan them over, and so you would be looking at a much more significant cost there. Also, other ways to consider is funding on how to get this. And then last question I would leave you with is whether or not a copyright is already in public domain, whether or not the copyright is still valid, or whether or not it's been fair use. And those are the fair use. I just want to go ahead and, I'm not saying, I just want to go ahead and clarify again. Those are just considerations. Those are not always clear cut. This is for sure, if it's a newspaper, it's going to be always fair use. That's not always the case. And at this time, I will go ahead and hand it back to Richard to go ahead and talk to you a little bit more about negotiation tactics.
Very good. Thank you for that hard work. As you can, I think, see, in some respects, the copyright issues themselves are, as a matter of law, not especially complicated, particularly when we're dealing with older works as opposed to the digital works. And I say that because we know what the law is. What's difficult is applying it. Okay? In other words, what's difficult is finding out who holds that copyright. And who else might, for example, hold a share of that copyright as a work for hire author. With these, as you know, with the work for hire doctrine, depending upon who the author is, they can have considerably more leverage in terms of what rights, which of those bundle of sticks they're able to retain. So that's a complicated thing, but it's not because the law itself at this point is complicated. It's because applying the law itself is more complicated. And so, from a negotiation perspective, what that tells me is that, as we mentioned in our suggestion, that you might want to think about narrowing the scope of what it is that we would be providing, just to limit the amount of work that it would take to identify the holders of these copyrights, maybe phasing this in over time. But from a negotiation standpoint, it is once we've identified the person who or entity that owns the copyrights, then it's a matter of seeing which of those bundles, which of those sticks we actually need to negotiate. In other words, we don't need to negotiate for access of the entire copyright. Really, what we need to negotiate for access to are the sticks that would allow us, or the rights that would allow us to make these accessible. Okay. We don't need to negotiate the video rights, for example. We don't need to negotiate the entertainment park rights. Really, all we need are just the rights that relate to making them accessible for republication through the Dark Archives project. That's it. That at least narrows the scope of what it is that we would need to negotiate. Now, with that, we would also need to recognize that there's a financial incentive here that those who have materials that are already exploited on other search engines, ProQuest, etc., are already taking advantage of. So we have to think about how to position this initiative, this project, so that we can coexist with those situations, or provide these holders of these materials. And I'm thinking particularly of these older newspapers that are really shut down, a reason and a capacity to be able to work with us. Now that, again, could mean negotiating with a local library or an historical society, because they may be the ones ultimately who hold that copyright. They may or may not have an interest in exploiting that, but if they do, for financial value, but if they do, that's something that we need to think through. I'm not sure, and there may be people in the room who are more familiar with this than I am. In fact, I'm sure there are, but I'm not sure that the industry has fully settled exactly on how to price and make that material available. We would need to work within those constraints and include that within the negotiations. Then finally, that I'd say that to the extent that these materials may be offered for fair use, or they may be offered, as elements of the public domain, that might be a way to think about how to structure this. So I like the way that Caroline put this in terms of it really depends. It depends because the facts themselves are what are particularly complicated here. The law itself, in some respects, can take care of itself. I'm not saying that there's not work to be done, but a project like this, I think, can proceed on the basis of existing law, and that law by itself is not particularly complicating. It's the circumstances that are. So with that note, I'll invite any questions or comments or concerns. Yeah.
Section 108 of the copyright law allows for certain preservation actions. Is there any progress on getting newspapers under that? I know that there's some actions to say that it's not all.
In a limited way, I'm not familiar with any legislative progress on that. I know that there's a significant intellectual property bill going on right now in Congress that deals with patents. It's not going to deal with that issue. But I would invite anyone else in the audience who may have a different set of information. Yeah.
Are we supposed to use these things? I was actually wondering if Martha could comment on maybe the relevancy of the Brobeck case decisions that David Kirsch worked through in the NDIP, for bankruptcy situations, and how it might, I don't know if it would relate to newspapers or not, but it certainly was a case of that seems relevant to this general topic.
Sure. We had a project that a business historian at the University of Maryland who petitioned the court for the right to archive business records of a law firm that went bankrupt at the end of the dot-com bust. And he considered it quite valuable for business history. And I think David worked on this about 4 years, actually. He had a lot of consultancy with lawyers and that sort of thing. But he went to the court several times and in the end won the right to archive this material out of the bankruptcy. But he had to go to the bankruptcy court. And so he is in the process of archiving it and making it available in a very, what they call an enclave, this protected research area where researchers agree to certain conditions for the research. But he has been successful in doing that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's not the copyright law at that point that is problematic. It's the bankruptcy law because again, a copyright, it's a piece of property. It's like this. A bottle writer. It's a piece of property with lots of different component parts to it. And what happens is when a newspaper goes bankrupt, it becomes that property becomes a part of the bankruptcy estate that the creditors are fighting over in order to be able to maybe sell to satisfy the debt that the organization, that the newspaper owes it. And they don't really have that much of an interest in preservation. They have an interest in exploitation.
But David didn't get ownership of his what he got was the right to archive it, right, Mark?
It was split. The physical archives went to Stanford University, and the digital materials went to David, with the ultimate disposition that it would come to the Library of Congress eventually.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Frederick Zarnt. I mentioned the Newspaper Licensing Agency and the Finnish Copyright Society. I think it's called Capisto. I'm not sure about that. In Finland, when you want to license or use a copyrighted work, you go to the Copyright Society and negotiate or procure rights to use it. Likewise, for the Newspaper Licensing Agency in the UK, if you want to use a news story, a copyrighted news story, you go to the Newspaper Licensing Agency, which is essentially a broker for copyrights, just as the Copyright Society is. Can you give any opinions as to why there's no such society here in the U.S.? Is it legally?
You want a legal opinion or a real opinion? Well, let me just say, first of all, we do have a copyright clearance center here in the United States that does that type of thing for individual works. But what we're talking about here is something very different. We're talking about getting archives from a number of different sources and making them available for search, for historical reasons or legal reasons or scholarly reasons, whatever. With the Copyright Clearance Center, you need to know which article that you're looking for and seek permission to get that done. To be able to use that publication. But this is very different. So that really wouldn't meet our purpose. I think the practical reason. How to put this? The practical reason is that it would require a lot of work, and a lot of legal work, and a lot of grunt work to be able to pull together something like that because of the complicated nature of identifying the owners of the copyright. In other words, I don't know what the Finnish society does, and I don't know what the UK society does, but I can say that here, in order to be able to do that, you would need to first have access to all of the owners of copyrights that are in the universe of publications that people would want access to. That is a very, very challenging task. So I think that's a practical, and legally it becomes complicated because you have to negotiate all of those relationships. It certainly can be done. You can create a template that allows you to do that, and I think that we will need to create a template for negotiation. In other words, saying this is what it is that we're asking for from you. This is how we perceive being able to provide you with some income from that, with some money for that. But it would need to be created. So that's just.
I think in Finland the copyright holders are obligated to work with a copyright society.
And just to add on to that, the reason why it is so difficult to determine exactly who is the copyright holder is, and I'm not familiar with Finland law, but I know in the United States you'll still have a copyright, and this is significant from other countries. You do not have to register it with the Copyright Office. And Finland might have a policy where as soon as, in order to get a copyright, you do have to apply for it, and you do have to report it to the office. But they don't have the same type of policy enacted over here.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Bernie Riley from Center for Research Libraries. I'm wondering, how threatened do publishers feel by a bunch of research libraries downloading their content and making it available for humanities scholarship? Is there a big exposure there?
Well, I think you're hearing laughter in the room because I think the answer is pretty obvious that they of course would feel threatened, and that's going to be that will be a complicating, although I don't think outcome determinative factor in our negotiations with copyright holders. For some, it may be outcome determinative, but that is as in any other area. In which both there are both profit-making components and non-profit components, you run into this tension.
I just wonder if that's an untested assumption, though. I mean, I'm just not aware of Harvard or Princeton or them getting sued for inadvertent breaches of copyright. I mean, I think what's happening today is that it's not just the content that's valuable on the market, it's the content plus the functionality. And if you could preserve the content in a way that doesn't provide a lot of marketable functionality like Factiva Insight, provides and LexisNexis provides and Reuters, whether that would be safe enough. I mean, the other possibility is just create a legal defense fund for the pool all our money.
You wouldn't have enough money to fund it. Is the problem? I think you're right. I mean, I think there are ways, and this is why I say it's a negotiation, because you structure the relationship in a way that is as least threatening as possible to the commercial interests that are out there, and that'll take some creativity. I think it can be done. Does Harvard get sued for copyright violations? Could.
Well, university with a $9 billion endowment probably would be a big target, but maybe fairly to consider.
And they may also be pretty good about taking steps to prevent that possibility. And so, yeah. Anything that you would add to that?
Oh, no. I was just going to say, generally the consensus was, with the people that I did talk to that did own the copyrights, they don't have an issue with distributing it exactly, and you're exactly right. They don't have any issues with, a lot of humanity purposes and, teaching purposes. The issue is when somebody actually takes it and claims when it's for teaching or humanitarian interests, or whatever it might be, when in fact it's not. And kind of where do you draw that line right there? That's their concern, is kind of going, okay, we're giving this for educational purposes, but what's to say that, this guy over here who's getting a commercial draw on it for selling it to his students isn't going to, he's going to claim this is for a teaching purpose as well. Did I answer that?
There is a similar situation with the Holocaust survivor recordings that the Visual History Foundation recorded and didn't bother to clear copyright for, but they created a kind of an enclave that basically a closed network of institutions where this content could be made available digitally, and so far it's held up.
And as a strategic matter, it may be a very wise thing for us to look at that and to see how they structured this. And in negotiating with the copyright holder, use a similar format. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Chris Cowan with ProQuest. I just had a question for clarification. Maybe I misunderstood you, Carolyn. When you said that it was the 95 years and extending 20 years from the 75, my understanding is it locked in at the end of 1922 as being in public domain, and it moves forward from there.
You're right. And that was, and thank you for clarifying that, that was a copyright legislation is always going through enactments. The most recent one was in 1978, but you are right. There was one done in 1922 as well, that it was changed.
Good. Yes, sir.
My name is Ron Larson from the Wisconsin Historical Society. My question has to do with newspaper copyright. Newspapers published between 1923 and 1976 or 77. I've been told, and I'm not sure if it's true, but if the publisher did not put its copyright notice or symbol on the paper, is it in the public domain?
That's something, okay, and I can go ahead and answer. Okay, it's going to be kind of a long answer. I don't want to answer it necessarily right now. I don't want to take up a lot of people's time. It is something that I can go ahead and answer to you later. That is something that is important. That's another aspect of law where they do have to put people on notice, so that way they can't, you can't create a monopoly out of So, for example, I don't have a copyright notice up here. You know, there is no way for you to be on notice that there is a copyright on my presentation. Therefore, it would be, you know, a court would consider that about it not being, since somebody did not have notice. But yeah, short answer. But I can talk to you more about that.
And
later.
let me just extrapolate a little bit more on that. You don't get copyright protection. I mean, as I would assume that most of you know, you don't get copyright protection automatically just because you wrote something down. You have to secure that copyright protection by filing for that protection with the with the Copyright Office. You're shaking your head no?
You can still. You don't.
I'm this is where I don't. This is where I don't know what I'm talking about. But the notice issue is a separate issue. So, sorry.
But don't you have to defend your copyright if you've registered it and then somebody compromises it? You have to take steps, or else.
You're exactly right. So copyright owners, and that's another really good point. I didn't bring up a lot of these issues because, as you can see and has already been demonstrated, it starts getting really, really complicated. And I'm just kind of keeping it at a really high level for you. And so the more detailed and stuff like that you guys know a lot more than I ever, intended or expected and everything else like that. So you definitely got me. But no, you are absolutely right. If somebody, you do have to take the copyright holder or owner does need to take they need to assert it themselves against other people who are possibly violating it. It doesn't just happen on its own. You are right.
Thank you.
Okay.